I'm Brian Washburn, and this is a webinar just about getting started in learning and development. We're going to really focus today, just throughout the course of this webinar, to kind of paint a picture of what the path could look like heading into the world of learning and development. I'll offer some specific actions that you can take, and we'll have some resources as well. We have a couple of handouts that we'll get to a little bit later on in the session as well. And as more people join us, I'm just going to give a little bit of contact information just in case you want to reach out to me directly. There's my email address right there. And let me tell you a little bit about Endurance Learning as we still have some people joining. So I'm Brian Washburn, and I'm one of the co-founders of Endurance Learning. One of my colleagues, Aaron Clark, is here and helping me with the logistics of today's session. Endurance Learning is a company that we started about 8 years ago in 2015. Our vision is that every learning opportunity can be engaging and lead to change. And if you want to check out more about us, our website is right there on the slide in front of you, endurancelearning.com. If you are interested in just kind of reaching out to me at some point, please do connect with me if you're not already connected on LinkedIn. There's my LinkedIn address right there, kind of towards the bottom middle of the screen. You can always feel free to shoot me an email. I'm happy to grab virtual coffee or just kind of connect in some way, shape, or form. There's a couple other things that are on the screen right there in front of you for those that are looking to kind of jump into the world of learning and development, figure out what kind of roles are out there in a little bit more intensive way than an hour-long webinar can offer you. We do have an 8-week course, which is called the L&D Pro Academy, and the Foundations course that will take you through kind of the landscape of all the possible jobs in the world of learning and development that are out there. So you can kind of get a feel for what's out there if you're looking for something. We'll get into some instructional design basics, some instructor-led training development, some e-learning development, play around with some other tools, get into some change management, project management, things like that. And then at the bottom of the screen, if you're ever just looking for just inspiration when it comes to a variety of elements, we have a periodic table, an interactive periodic table of elements that can go into any sort of learning program. And you can find that at 51elements of learning.com. If you want to learn a lot more about it, there's a whole book about it called What's Your Formula, about how to string together these elements to create impactful training. So that is my announcement section. But thank you again for joining us. And before I get too far into my own thoughts in terms of getting started in the world of learning and development, I just want to kind of figure out who all is with us here today. And so what the first question that I have, and if you could use the chat box, I would love to know what are you currently doing or what are you currently working on? So maybe some people are trainers, maybe some people are not in the world of training. I'm just kind of curious if you could put in the chat, what are you currently doing today, or what are you currently working on today? We have some teachers applying for jobs, which is awesome. Hopefully there's some thoughts and ideas and resources that will be helpful to you. International school teacher, instructional designer, virtual educator, social work. I'm seeing some trends in terms of K-12, but there's a lot of other sorts of experiences too, which is pretty exciting. Education supervisor, was working in an international school, trainer. So we have a variety of folks who are joining us. And the next question that I have for you, when you think specifically of the world of learning and development, and it sounds like some people are already in the space for learning and development, might be kind of trying to figure out what else is out there, how else might I be able to get my foot in the door for a better position. Regardless of whether you're in the field of learning and development right now, or if you're looking to break into the field, a second question that I have for you is why? Why do you want to get into this field of learning and development? Why are you going to do this to yourself? Why are you going to try to change what you might be currently doing and break into the world of learning and development? I'd love to hear that too in the chat. If you could put that in there. seeing some thoughts in terms of trying to find some work-life balance, especially so I am married to a teacher. I totally get it for those that are in the world of kind of K-12 education. That actually is the work-life balance can be a struggle. Certainly, it's exciting and energizing, passionate about training people well, and the world needs people who are passionate, not just about training, but training people well. And that's one of the reasons why I got into this field as well. Uh, People feel that they're really good at teaching skills, but want to take those skill sets and look for something else that is kind of related to it, passionate about continuous learning. Excuse me for a second. My headphones was making me a little itchy here. Passionate about continuous learning, transfer skill set. Yep. I'm seeing a lot, again, some themes here. And Aaron, if you're seeing anything that kind of jumps out to you, feel free to chime in too, to let me know kind of what you're seeing. I'm trying to monitor the chat and also speak at the same time. So, but yeah, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a little bit about my own journey and how I got into the field of learning and development. And then I'm going to kind of draw a few lessons that I learned along the way, share those in the context of like action items that might be really helpful if you really want to get that foot into the door. So, as I said, I'm Brian Washburn, and I haven't always been the person that gets to stand on the stage and talk about presentation skills and talk about how to put training together, talk about instructional design, things like that. And I'll be very clear. A lot of times when I'm putting together training these days, I know very little about the industry. I know very little about the content that I'm putting the training together. So when it came to how I got involved in the world of training and development, I focused specifically on instructional design skills, and then I became very content agnostic. I did in terms of the journey. It wasn't something that I went to high school and wrote a paper about how what I want to be when I grow up is I want to be in the world of learning and development. I want to be a trainer. I want to be an instructional designer. I didn't even know those fields existed. But there was something after I finished college. I went into the Peace Corps, and there's me in the Peace Corps. And what I found that I really enjoyed, and when I came back home after being in Paraguay for 2 years, I spent some time thinking, okay, well, what is it that I want to do? And I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, but I knew that I really liked being out in with the farmers using flip chart and markers and doing some educational something, but I didn't think that farmers would really appreciate here in the States if I was to show up on the farm with flip chart and markers. And so I wasn't sure what I was going to do. And what I ended up doing was I went into not necessarily the K-12 education field, but I started teaching GED classes at a youth center in Washington, D.C. And when I did that for a little while, I started to take a look at master's programs. I was thinking, oh, I'm pretty good at this. Why don't I get my master's degree maybe in teaching? But when I started to look up what should I focus on for my master's degree, I was looking at adult basic education because that's really where the world of GED classes lands. And what I was coming up with in my Google searches was adult education and instructional design and organization development. I was like, "Oh, what is this?" And that opened my eyes to this world of corporate training, of learning and development. And eventually I was able to slide into a job with an organization that I was working at where I was able to do some training. And my boss did a really good job. I'm forever appreciative and grateful for him and his mentorship of me. And one of the best pieces of advice that he gave me as I started was he said, Brian, you should really get a membership to ATD, to the Association for Talent Development. And I did. And what I could not wait for every month, I was looking, I would stop by the company mailboxes to see if it had arrived, but I was looking for my edition of TD Magazine each month. And so when you join the Association for Talent Development, and it's I don't know, $250 a year. I'm not sure exactly what the price is at this point each year, you get a subscription to their monthly magazine, and I would read that cover to cover. I would read the articles to try to find out what are the trends in the industry, what are some of the hot topics, who are some of the thought leaders, what is some of the language I should be using, what are some books that I should be reading when it came to the industry, and when I would read the magazine from cover to cover, I couldn't help but think I would love at some point to not just read these articles, but to be able to write an article for TD Magazine. I thought that would be the coolest thing. And fast forward a few years, I had a chance to actually write a few articles for TD Magazine, and through ATD, I was able to actually publish a couple of books. The one on the left, "What's Your Formula," came out about 2 years ago, and then the one on the right, "Instructional Design on a Shoestring," will be out in January. And so I got a lot from my membership in ATD in terms of just educating myself about the field of learning and development. One of the things that, and I see that Matt put in the chat that ATD currently is $279 per year for the national membership, and we'll talk about the difference between the national membership and local membership a little bit later, because I do feel that there's value in both if you're looking to break into the field of learning and development. But this was all while I was in Washington, D.C. And then in 2007, I moved out to Seattle, and excuse me, and I took a job as the director of training for the National CASA Association. So CASA stands for Court Appointed Special Advocate. And as I was getting a better feel and starting my first opportunity to lead a team in the world of learning and development, and you all might be thinking, wait a second, you took a job in DC. It was your first training job. You got membership to ATD, and suddenly you're moving out to Seattle to be the training director. And yes, it kind of happened like that. I spent a few months in my role as a trainer, as a training kind of program manager in DC. There was a job that a friend of a friend actually brought to my attention that was in Seattle, and I took a look at it. I applied for it. I studied. I read all the books, and so when I went to the interview in Seattle, I was able to talk a really good game. I had an internal reference for me, and somehow they decided to trust their training programs in my hands. And so that was kind of a fortunate series of events. That was also something, when you think of luck, it's when where preparation meets opportunity. And I did. I had prepared myself. I had worked on getting some internal references, and then was able to talk my way into that first job. I've spent most of my year in the nonprofit sector. Peace Corps isn't really nonprofit, but working for that youth center and teaching GED classes, the training director at the National CASA Association, which works in the foster care system. There's another nonprofit that I worked for in Seattle as well before starting endurance learning. And when I moved out to Seattle, I continued that um, the 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 membership for ATD in a national sense, but I also met some people who said, "Hey, have you ever thought about joining the local chapter out here in Seattle for ATD?" And that's when I started to explore ATD Puget Sound, the Puget Sound chapter out here in Seattle. And this is actually where I met Aaron for the very first time. We didn't work together. Aaron was somebody who was a member and was volunteering for the chapter, and would always, I remember Aaron's face. She would always greet everybody with a smile. It's very warm and welcoming as we showed up to different events. And when I became a member of ATD Puget Sound, I started to think, this is kind of a cool organization. There's great people here to meet and to network with. I wonder if I could get involved a little bit more. And so I did. I started to volunteer for the chapter, and eventually I followed in Aaron's footsteps and became the chapter president for our local chapter here in Seattle. Beyond that, there's a few other things that I was doing in order to just kind of work on my own skill set. But and I didn't intend for this to happen, but at the same time, it started to expose me to a whole world of other training practitioners out there, and people started to reach out to me and ask me for my own thoughts and my own opinions when it came to the world of learning and development. And the one thing that I did back in 2012 was I started a blog. It was called Train Like a Champion, because just like some of what I was reading from some of your all comments, why do you want to get into the world of L&D? I wanted to just bring my own skill set to this world to create meaningful, really good, well put together training sessions. And I brought that into my blog. And so Train Like a Champion was a little bit of play off of Notre Dame. The Notre Dame football team has a sign up above their locker room as they leave the locker room and head out to the field for each game day. And it says, "Play like a champion today." And so I was like, "Ooh, train like a champion. Let's be really intense and be really good at what we do with training." So that was my blog. And then at some point after that blog, I had been writing that blog pretty consistently for several years. There was an editor at TD Magazine through ATD who came across my blog and said, "Hey, would you mind if we spotlighted your blog in TD Magazine?" And I was like, "Would I mind? I think that would be awesome." And so they spotlighted the blog in TD Magazine, which was great. About the same time, I had been writing a blog for about a year, and I ended up having to go to Washington, D.C. for a conference and decided to meet up with a friend of mine um, from my college days, and we had breakfast at the diner in Washington, D.C. If you're familiar with Washington, D.C., the Adams Morgan neighborhood. And as we started talking, I said, "Tim, I have this great idea. What would happen? What do you think of this idea for this training kind of product?" And my friend Tim thought it was a great idea, and Tim and I started bouncing some ideas around over the next several years, and that was actually the genesis for endurance learning. And so that has been a little bit about my own journey into this world of learning and development. And I share that because that is not the only way that you can break into the field. It's not like you have to kind of go into the world of Peace Corps and then teach GED classes and then get a training job and then luck into a training director role and then start your own company. But there are some things that I did along that way that were really helpful, and I wanted to kind of spotlight those. But let me pause here and ask you, kind of just listening to my story, maybe even kind of thinking of your own story in terms of how you're starting to position yourself for a role in learning development. I'd love to hear from you in terms of, what actions that I shared or that I kind of talked about stood out for you. And I'm going to give you kind of a top 10 list of actions that you might want to take in order to best position yourself in the world of learning and development. But was there anything that I did specifically that kind of jumped out for you when you think of your own kind of journey or your own positioning for a role in learning and development? Go ahead and
Ryan,
put
do you
your
want
own.
them to take themselves off mute or put it in the chat?
They can put it in the chat.
Great.
So networking. So the first thing that I saw was networking locally. And that actually is such an important piece. And so I'm just going to kind of share some of these. And please go ahead and continue to put your thoughts into the chat. But the first thing that I saw was the power of networking locally. And I wrote on this slide, meet people. And the reason I wrote on that slide, meet people, is because some people have told me that the idea of networking can be intimidating to them. And I think that that word is a word that can be scary, it can be intimidating, but the idea of being able to go out and talk with people and meet people, it's really just finding other people who share a common interest, which is learning and development. One of the things about this is that it's not necessarily you can do lots of. I'm going to give you 9 other action items here. I'm going to give you resources. You can do lots of these other action items, but when you're looking to apply for a job, oftentimes it's as much who you know as what you know. So if you think of my own story and being able to have a connection within this nonprofit first before I applied for that training job, that was, I don't even know if my resume would have been looked at, had that person not walked up to the hiring manager and said, you should at least look at this resume, maybe give him a phone screening, see if he's worth our while. So being able to meet people is really helpful, A, for internal references, B, because sometimes um, you might be talking with somebody and they'll say, oh, you know what, Aaron, I love this conversation. There's not much I can do, but there's actually this other person who I think you might be able to connect with, who might be really, really helpful. And so that is kind of the way to build a network. Let's see. Educate yourself is another thing that I saw up there, and that's absolutely correct. So educate yourself on industry trends and lingo is so important, especially if you're coming from the world of K-12 education. Being able to talk the talk, being able to kind of use the same vocabulary that people use in a corporate sense, as opposed to some of the things perhaps that you talk about in a K-12 setting. Sometimes there's some translations that need to be made. So being able to educate yourself, whether that is reading a book, like I joined ATD, I would read the magazine, listen to podcasts, watch a YouTube tutorial. If reading is not your thing, if listening to podcasts isn't your thing, YouTube has a lot of videos out there that are just on the world of learning and development, or maybe e-learning if you want to start to get into the world of e-learning development and things like that. But really educating yourself on the fundamentals and trends and thought leaders that are in the field can kind of lead you on a path and help you kind of develop your own self-study curriculum as well. Let's see. What else do we see here? I'm gonna just kind of share some of these other thoughts that I had. So LinkedIn, I can't overstate the importance of LinkedIn. It's helpful, it's good to have a resume and to update your resume and to really translate your resume, again, especially for those that are coming from um, kind of a field that is adjacent but not the same. So K-12 going into the world of learning and development, there is some vocabulary that you're going to want to translate on your resume and also on your LinkedIn profile. But when you think of having a really effective LinkedIn profile, there's a few things that you can be doing. So if you're not on, first of all, if you're not on LinkedIn, or if you're not really active, if you set up a profile several years ago, but you haven't been to it, LinkedIn is a really good resource, especially as A, you're trying to learn more about the industry, so you can make connections that way. And B, it's where employers will look at resumes, but also LinkedIn is becoming a spot where a lot of people are kind of looking at as well. I want to share just a few different profiles. So here's my profile. If you take a look at LinkedIn, you want to just make sure, and I'm not necessarily an expert on creating the best LinkedIn profile, but you want to make sure that you have a professional photo in there. I've seen some people who have kind of their photos of themselves hiking or other things like that. You want to make sure they have a professional photo. And then, kind of you have this long bar that can kind of show you a little bit more about who you are. I have my new book is coming out, so I want people's attention to be drawn to that. But there's a couple other profiles that I really, I'm going to spotlight here. So this woman's name is Asha. She's been a podcast guest of mine several times. She's written a book called Skills, the Common Denominator. So if you're thinking about changing industries, her book, Skills, the Common Denominator, is a really good book that helps people kind of think about how they can take their current skill set and pivot into another industry. But I really like her profile as well. She likes to kind of position herself as somebody who can speak, and so she has an image of her speaking. And then you can take a look, and the about section as well is a space for you to be able to tell your own story. And then, of course, you have your experience as well. And then Jessica Kriegel, another person who was a podcast guest of mine. She is she's a keynote speaker. She speaks a lot about organizational and company culture. Again, I like kind of how she's put her profile together. That professional headshot, her keynote speaking imagery right there, her own logo. And the other thing about LinkedIn is that you can tell more of a story than you can with your resume. And so even if an employer isn't necessarily going to take a look at LinkedIn, the contacts that you make at an organization may want to take a look at that profile. And so you can put things in here in terms of, is there a way that you can show people how you train or how you present? Do you have a portfolio, which is something else that I would mention here? It's going to be number 5 on the slide, but do you have some other things that you'd like to showcase that can show people who you are, what you're capable of doing? So there's a lot of different things that you can put up there in terms of telling a little bit better story about who you are. I started to mention this, but a portfolio is also going to be really helpful to help you stand out. And so a lot of times employers, they like to hear during an interview what you think you're capable of doing. But if you've ever interviewed a lot of people, um, you kind of need to know what's going to make somebody stand out, right? So a lot of people can answer questions really well. It's tougher to fake it on a portfolio. And so if you've been working on, you know, e-learning skills, or if you have a sample lesson plan, slide deck, some other things that you might be able to put together that show an employer what you're capable of doing, that portfolio can really help you stand out. Speaking of creating a portfolio, if you're like, Brian, I think e-learning would be kind of cool, but I don't really know anything about it. I haven't done anything like that. Something else that you might want to think about is just experimenting. And that could be just kind of figuring out what are the tools out there. So again, doing some research and educating yourself, and figuring out what are some of the tools of the trade. If you're going to be focused on instructor-led training, so being up in front of people, um, you might want to play around with PowerPoint. PowerPoint is more than just words and images on a slide. If you take a look at this slide, it's a little bit more dynamic. I'm clicking on, I'm not just clicking next, I'm clicking on each of these numbers one by one, and it's revealing them. I could click on 10, or I can click on 7 next. So figuring out, what all can you do with some of your visual aids? Or do you want to sign up for a 30-day free trial of something like a rapid authoring tool that you might use when it comes to e-learning development, and start to create something? There's a lot of tutorials out there about creating e-learning. So just being able to experiment with some of the tools of the trade can help you kind of figure out where your strengths might be, where some of your passion might be able to be channeled. Another thing that I would suggest is research. Not just about the tools of the trade, not just about some of the trends, but research what's out there. What kind of jobs are out there? Because a lot of times when I will have coffee or virtual coffee with a teacher, teachers oftentimes will tell me, "Oh, I'd like to be a trainer," right? So I'm in front of people every day, and so I think that I could just kind of do that, but instead of with students, with professionals. But there are a lot of other roles out there beyond just training people. So you could be an instructional designer, and we have folks on our team at Endurance Learning who just design lesson plans or just create storyboards, just create the PowerPoint. They don't actually get in front of people, train. You can be an e-learning developer, an LMS administrator, a project manager. Maybe you want to just kind of focus on you've always been a good listener, and people come to you for to be a sounding board or for some advice. So maybe a coach or an executive coach is where you want to go. But researching kind of what you want to be doing can also be really helpful. The field of learning and development is a big tent. And so within that, there are a variety of kind of subspecialties. We mentioned this before. I don't know that I would be where I am without the local ATD chapter. And so while the national chapter was really helpful at one level, the local chapter has also been pretty helpful. And then this is one of those things where I've talked with people who hire people looking to get into the field of learning and development. And they say, especially when it comes to teachers, but not exclusively teachers. So this is something that they say about anybody who's kind of trying to break into the field. Teachers are great because they know instructional design. They can put together learning objectives. They can get in front of people and teach. They have really good strategies. And there are other muscles that they have never developed. Things like project management, things like being able to talk to a subject matter expert in order to figure out what should I create this training on. The subject matter expert just wants to spew all sorts of information because that's all their expertise. So how do we target the information they give us to make sure that the training program we're going to put together is going to be effective and useful and narrow, not just kind of this broad spewing of information. So working on those non-learning and development muscles, things like relationship building, things like working with subject matter experts to get the right information, things like project management or change management are all really, really important. And then the last thing I will mention here, and this was one of the first things that was so helpful to me, was finding a mentor. And so I had a boss who was willing to do that too. I see some questions in the chat, which will be I'll get to those. So stick around. But let me get through just this last piece here. Mentoring. I can't emphasize this piece enough either. It's really helpful to have, excuse me, to have somebody who's going to be a sounding board. It's really helpful to find somebody who has experience in the field and who can be like, oh, Brian, you might want to try to get a membership in ATD, or have you thought about this, or when you volunteer, or ooh, you seem stuck. Let's talk about that. Let's figure out why you're stuck. And so these are all really, really important pieces. And Aaron is going to put a handout that has all of these with some additional information about each of these into the chat. So she's going to actually put two handouts. In the second handout, because it's not enough for me just to be able to say, here's some actions to take, without actually giving you some resources to help you take those actions. That would be pretty empty of me to say that. And so let's talk about some of the resources that would be helpful. And as you can see, there are two handouts that Aaron just put into the chat, and we'll email these to you. If so, if for some reason you're not able to download these handouts, the first handout is actions to take, and the second handout is about resources. Resources that could be really, really helpful to you as you start to get ready for a role in the world of learning and development. And so how are you going to educate yourself? Yes, there are certainly some books out there and magazines and things like that. One of the things that could be really, really helpful is that there are free and low-cost webinars that are out there every week. And so if you're connected with me on LinkedIn, on Mondays, I will publish a list of free webinars that are taking place over the week. And I try to do that every week on Mondays. But if you're looking for sources for these webinars, there's a few sources that I will always look to because they're very consistent in offering these free or low-cost webinars. So Training Magazine Network is one of those. Training Industry is another. The Bob Pike Group is a training company started by a gentleman named Bob Pike, and who's one of the pioneers in the world of creative training techniques. And his daughter has taken over the company, and they. If you take a look at anything that I create when it comes to training, you'll see a lot of influence from Bob Pike and his work. The e-learning industry, and then also formerly known as eLearning Brothers, but ELB Learning. So here are 5 sources of free webinars where they will deliver webinars, sometimes multiple webinars a week. And in the handout that Aaron sent, I actually have links to each of these, so you just have to click on them. But if you wanted to Google them as you're taking a look at this, that's totally fine too. Another area that would be really helpful, I've mentioned this before, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. The Association for Talent Development, they're the national organization. They have things such as, obviously I've spoken about the magazine. When you become a member, you have access to content that's behind their paywall. Their website is td.org, which you can get some resources just by going to td.org, but once you're a member, you can get behind the paywall and take a look at articles, podcasts, webinars, webinar archive, things like that. There's several other organizations in the learning field that I want to make sure that you know as well. ATD is not the only organization in the field that is looking to bring people together and kind of promote the field. There's also the Learning Guild. There is Training Magazine Network. And then if you were in the world of life sciences, there's L10, which is the Life Sciences Trainers and Education Network. So if you're more focused on things like pharmaceuticals or biotech, L10 is kind of the place to be for that. I did mention the idea of developing a portfolio. Now, I also mentioned that you can do this on your own by experimenting and just kind of pulling together maybe some of your previous work. If you are looking for a more specific or more structured way to develop a portfolio, then you can go ahead and maybe enroll in an academy. There are a number of academies out there that are generally online courses, and they range in price from a few hundred to a few $1,000s, and they range in terms of their duration as well. So some, take a few weeks, and some take several months. Endurance Learning, we do have our own academy, which will be launching in December, and there is a quick link to it. But again, if you take a look at the handout, there's a website that you can go to that will give you those links. Another area to focus on or to offer you some inspiration and to take action would be to listen to podcasts. And there are a number of really good just training podcasts out there. I'm going to mention 5, but there are, if you just Google learning and development training podcasts, you'll find more. So there's Train Like You Listen, which is the endurance learning podcast, and that one's short form. So we try to keep that one to 10 or 15 minutes about all things learning and development in bite-sized chunks. And it has a range of topics from how do you break into the field of learning and development. There actually is a really, really good one that Asha Aravindakshan, who I showed her her LinkedIn profile earlier, but she actually did a kind of a fishbowl session with a former teacher who was looking to break into the field of learning and development. And she just kind of asked some questions and said, maybe you want to consider this or that. So that is a specific episode, but there's lots of different topics when it comes to Train Like You Listen. And then there's a number of other podcasts that could be really interesting as well. One of our fellow ATD Puget Sound members has a podcast called Share What You Learned, where she interviews guests to ask them, what have you learned recently, or what have you learned in the past week, and how did it go? If you ask Betty, is somebody, it's a podcast hosted by Betty Danowitz, who is in the Detroit area. She is somebody who I met through LinkedIn. I had so many conversations with Betty, even before we ever met in person, through just social media and through things like LinkedIn. So again, if you're kind of like, what's the value of getting involved and spending more time on the computer and social media and LinkedIn, those connections are really, really helpful. Mind Tools L&D podcast is a bigger industry podcast. And then if podcasts aren't necessarily a thing, but you want to go more YouTube, Carl Kopp, who is kind of one of the leading experts in the field of learning and development when it comes to games and gamification, has a YouTube channel called The Unofficial Unauthorized History of Learning Games. And so if games are your thing, that's kind of a really cool series on YouTube to take a look at as well. Then, of course, reading books is one thing that's really if you want to go longer form, there is, especially for those who are teachers looking to transition into the world of training, there is a book written specifically for you, Teachers to Trainers: Apply Your Passion and Skills to a New Career. And there's a podcast on Train Like You Listen that has the author speaking about that. This is a periodic table that I mentioned before. It is featured in the book, What's Your Formula? Yes, it's a shameless plug, but I will plug it, and I will say one of the things about What's Your Formula that could be really helpful is it goes pretty broad on 51 different areas in training and development. Not super deep, but then if you wanted to go deep, there's a bunch of references in terms of where you can get more information. And then if you're looking for e-learning, Tim Slade, who is an e-learning designer, has a book called the E-Learning Designer's Handbook, and it's super accessible. So if you're just trying to get into the world of e-learning, he has a lot of really good information in there for you. And then when you want to go beyond just kind of the world of training, but also in terms of how people learn and what does the science and what does the psychology say to us, Julie Dirksen has a great book out there called Design for How People Learn. And all of these books are kind of industry standards. And so if you get on LinkedIn, if you ever go to an ATD conference, Julie oftentimes presents, and there's a lot of really good information that is pretty foundational in her book, Design for How People Learn. I think she has a new book that's coming out very soon, or maybe it just was released too. And then one of my favorites, and something that really does, um, it's something that um, it inspires basically everything that we design at Endurance Learning, is Jane Vella's idea of dialogue education, and it's through dialogue that we learn is kind of her philosophy. So her book, Learning to Listen, Learning to Teach. All right. I've already shared about LinkedIn, several people to follow. And again, in the resource handout that Aaron shared, I will, there's a list, I think, of 12 people just to get you started. So you might want to follow. Kara North, I'm going to highlight her because she every day, I believe at 8 a.m. Eastern, she posts a list of L&D jobs that are remote. And so you don't even have to leave your house if you get one of those jobs. But and then she has lots of good thoughts throughout the days and weeks about learning and development. But she's a really good person to follow on LinkedIn. Like I mentioned, Asha Aravindakshan talks a lot about making career pivots and how you can go ahead and do that. Myra Roldan is somebody who works for Amazon. She is located in Nevada now, but she posts a lot about technology and learning, and does some really cool stuff in terms of tutorials, in terms of live LinkedIn sessions. She's really into technology. So if technology is your thing, Myra Roldan would be a great person to follow. And then Will Thalheimer is somebody who's known across the industry for taking a look at research and then translating it to plain English, so that we trainers don't have to spend time reading all these scientific journals. He's the one who does that, and then he'll kind of translate them. And so he does a lot of research-based work. He also, one of his areas of specialty is how do you assess whether or not people are learning, and how do you do that effectively? All right, I've thrown a ton of information at you over the course of the past 43 minutes. I'm going to stop there. We're going to pause here for some questions. I see some questions in the chat, which I'm happy to get to. Also, if you feel better just kind of taking yourself off of mute and asking a question, we can go ahead and do that as well. And I'm going to ask Aaron if you might be able to kind of sift through some of the questions that are in the chat, so that I can kind of get caught up here.
Yeah, you've done a really great job of and unknowingly answering the questions as they came in. One question was, how do we create a portfolio without any experience in learning and development? And you talked a little bit about that, but that was a question that came up. And then there was
Yeah.
also a book resource.
Okay. So let me talk about the idea of the portfolio, because it's a really good question. Because and I'm glad that you asked it, because I personally, as somebody who has applied for jobs and also somebody who hires other people for training roles, the portfolio for me is one of the things that kind of that helps me decide whether or not they get through the gate. Should I even interview this person? And so having a portfolio is really important. That said, if you don't currently have a portfolio, do you have to go out and create a bunch of training projects? No, you do not. But basically what a portfolio can offer is a sample of what you're capable of doing. And so depending on what kind of job you are applying for, you're going to want to think through, okay, well, I've never kind of worked on instructor-led training, but I see that there is this position for instructional designer. for instructor-led training. So what you might want to do is just start to think through, okay, well, if I had to design a program to train people on instructional design, how would I do that? What would a 60-minute session look like? Here's a lesson plan for it. Now, if you want to have several, just to kind of give somebody an idea, just kind of go with what you know. So if I had to teach people classroom management, this would be a 60-minute session on that and create a lesson plan for that, maybe a set of slides that could go with that. And if it comes to e-learning, uh, again, a lot of the popular tools, things like Articulate Storyline. Well, I will say Articulate Storyline and Articulate Rise are the industry standards when it comes to e-learning. There are other organizations that use some other tools, but those might be the ones you want to focus on, especially if you've never played around with e-learning before. And Articulate has a really cool online community called the e-learning heroes, uh, Articulate e-learning heroes. And each week, there's somebody at Articulate who lists a challenge. So can you create this screen? Can you make an end of quiz result screen look different than what the default is? So there's a number of different exercises you could do there. The other thing that I mentioned before was if you want some more structure to creating a portfolio, you might want to go ahead and start to investigate some sort of academy. And as I mentioned, we have one, but that may be a good fit for some folks and it may not. Tim Slade has an academy. There are a number of different academies out there. So you might want to just kind of do your research and make sure you find the one that fits what you need and also fits your schedule and your style. Did you have a question about a book, Erin?
There was a recommendation about a book, so I'll mention that. Talk to the Elephant by Julie Dirksen just came out. Annie shared that. And then to kind of continue with you talking about academies and portfolios, there's some great questions in the chat. So one is, when looking for an academy to create a portfolio, what elements should that academy have to set us up for success?
That's another great question. One of the things that I would just kind of do a little bit of caution about when it comes to academies is I know that there are some academies out there who say, we guarantee that you'll find a job after going through our program. Be careful with that. Now, they might have some sort of money back guarantee. I don't know what else stands behind that guarantee. That's something just to be careful about, because there's no way that an academy organization can guarantee that you will have a job when you finish their program, unless they're going to hire you, which I don't know of many academies that are going to do that. So that is one thing to be careful about. Now, when it comes to what elements should that academy have to set you up for success and to set you apart, that's a really good question. Again, one of the things that I would kind of emphasize is doing some research in terms of what kind of role do you want to start with. So if you know that you want to do e-learning, you want to look for something that is more e-learning focused. If you know that you want to do something that is instructor-led, you have to look for something that's more instructor-led focused. There's a number of academies out there, and a number of them are virtual or online or self-paced and do a lot of video work, or self-directed courses. And a lot of those are for e-learning. And so you'll just want to kind of take a look and say, well, what do I want to be doing in order to make sure that it's a good investment of my time and my money? So those would be some things that I would say you want to take a look at first. Now, in terms of, you may also want to ask, when you're taking a look at an academy, to make sure it's a good use of your money, what will my portfolio look like by the end of this course? And they should be able to give you some thoughts and ideas. But as an employer, when it comes to being able to take a look at somebody's portfolio, I want to see that portfolio aligns with kind of the job description, what I'm going to be asking them to do. And so you might want to stay pretty general in terms of what your portfolio looks like, especially if you don't have anything to start with, but also kind of start to take a look at some of those specific jobs. Go to Indeed.com and just put in training designer, training trainer, instructional designer, training manager, training specialist. and see what those job descriptions entail, and then try to figure out, okay, what's going to be an academy program that might help me develop something that.
That's great. And Catherine asked a great question. How would you suggest finding a mentor?
Ooh, that's a great question. And so I have some thoughts. If other people, because I did see that there were some comments about, oh yes, I have a great mentor. So if other people have some thoughts about this too, please do put your thoughts into the chat. For me, it was really helpful. There has been one brief moment in my life where I was in a training role and the person above me actually also was in a training role. Most of my career, even the training roles that I've had, I've been supervised by people who have no background in training. And so if you do have somebody, if you're working for an organization and there is somebody in a training role who's more experienced than you, then that's a pretty good relationship to foster. There are other ways to do it, and mentoring can come in a couple of different forms. It can be formal, hey, will you be my mentor? Or it can be more informal, hey, would you mind having coffee? I'd love to pick your brain. Do you mind if we do this from time to time? And so you'll have to decide, what kind of relationship you want, first of all. What kind of mentoring do you need? For me, the way that I was able to find a variety of different people was my supervisor was a really good place to start. And then being able to connect with people and make some connections through LinkedIn and through the local ATD chapter. And for me, it was always a more informal process. Hey, would you mind if we grab coffee? Now, it's really interesting. Some people are like, oh, I'll never grab coffee without being paid. You might want to stay away from some of those folks. I can see where they're coming from. Hey, I've earned all this experience and my time is valuable. And so I'm not just going to give it to you for free. And that is something that will sometimes happen. My own philosophy is that I have an hour to spare. I can give back. A lot of people have helped me along the way, and I can certainly give back as well. Aaron, I'd love to hear your thoughts to this idea as well.
I love that. I think for me, it's a lot of echoing what you said. So it's networking with people. And I think that informal mentorship can be just as powerful as a formal mentor. So having someone that, like you said, you could just say, hey, can we connect every once in a while? And connecting with additional people to find that person you really click with, I think is really important, because the chemistry between you and someone that you're going to be mentoring can be really critical to set you on a path for success.
It looks like we're starting to wind down in terms of the questions, in terms of any of the chat. It looks like that's starting to wind down. If anybody does have other questions and you didn't necessarily want to ask them here, my information, it was up on the screen, is brian@endurancelearning.com, or connect with me on LinkedIn. Like I said, I'm happy to have virtual coffee, unless you're here in Seattle, and I'd like to grab actual coffee and just talk more about this. But if anything pops into your head that you're not thinking about right now, please do feel free to send us a note. Otherwise, thank you so much for attending. Oh, who wrote the book about research-based work? So Julie Dirksen was the person who I spotlighted with that specific book, Designed for How People Learn. Will Thalheimer also has a number of books out there. Is there a resource you know of that specifically helps people practice for interviews? That is a good question, Aaron. I don't know if you've come across anything, especially specifically for L&D work, but I think one of the podcasts that I did in the spring was with a hiring manager, actually. And that might be something that we'll put into a follow-up email as well. But I was asking her, what are you looking for when you're hiring for a training role? And she shared some thoughts about that. So that was a really cool podcast. Can you share again the name? Oh, the person who posts LinkedIn at 8 a.m. Eastern, Kara North. Yes. Kara is one of the kindest people in the learning field, and I love the fact I don't even know where she finds these jobs, but the whole list of remote based L&D roles each and every day. All right, it looks like the questions have tapered off. Getting lots of thank yous. Well, I would like to thank you all. Thank you, Aaron, for helping to produce this. And thank you all for giving just some time just to listen to some of these thoughts. Again, if there's anything I can do, please feel free to reach out. Otherwise, have a great rest of your week and happy training to everyone.
Thank you so much, Brian.